we would come to a time, and I do feel it's now, when we would literally remember who we really are. And we would remember our terrestrial, our intraterrestrial, and our extraterrestrial heritage.
I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Jude Currivan. How you doing, Dr. Jude?
I'm delighted to be here, Alex. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a very rainy day in England, so you're bringing sunshine into my day. So thank you so much.
I appreciate that. I heard you guys had a fairly warm summer that passed.
We did, but we're now making up for it, and we're getting the blessings of the rain.
Good. Because England is beautiful, but it's not known for its wonderful white sand beaches.
Well,
is it?
Some nice beaches, but at the moment, I personally would not invite you onto one because all there would be is lots of rain and lots of waves.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. So I'm going to just jump right into it. How did you begin your journey into spirituality and science, I love that bridge that you're able to bring between the two?
It's so far past. I was 4 years old, really, when I began this journey. And it was more a dance because it wasn't, spirituality or science. It was a dance of the two right from the get-go. I was very young. I grew up in the north of England. My dad was a coal miner, as was my granddad. So we were not an intellectual family by any stretch, but there was a lot of love. And that was just as well, because I think I was the cuckoo in the nest, because I was a very strange child. Insofar that I was experiencing sort of multidimensional realities, literally, since I was very early, since I was about 4 years old. So I was having telepathic experiences, precognitive dreams, out-of-body experiences. And I was also engaging and communicating with what, a lot of parents would have described as imaginary friends. But since I didn't tell anybody that I was having these communications, nobody said, oh, they're just imaginary. And that became a lifelong journey of literally walking between worlds in such a natural way that it's part and parcel of my life. So my spirituality, if we want to call it that, because it never felt separate from the rest of my life and an experience, an existence, but nonetheless, that non-physicalized, I suppose, aspects of my life were there from the very earliest times. But I do remember as well, when I was about the same age, looking up into the sky and being fascinated by the stars. And somehow there was something within me that from a very, again, early age, I was able to recognize the patterns that we call constellations. And so from 6, 7, 8 years old, if I'd have been sort of plonked down in a strange place, I would have been able to find my way home through the stars. And so I was fascinated by the universe, and so science. And as and my question was, from that day, those days, how was what I was experiencing? How did that then bridge into the realities of our universe? Because I was experiencing the world as a much, much grander place. So for me, there's never been a bridge. It's never been a bridge because there's never been, for me, a bridge to cross. It was just experiencing, seeing, exploring the world in those two different ways. One more from the head and one more from the heart and the experience.
Well, let me ask you, at a certain point in your travels, you realize that not everybody has these talkings to the different, multi-realities and have this kind of understanding. So I'd imagine at a certain point in your journey, you said, oh, I'm the weirdo. I'm the one that nobody else, I better either keep this quiet or come out with it. But then you also went down the academic route, which I know does not, it's not very open-minded to this kind of this kind of talk. So how did you deal or, kind of balance those two worlds once you realized that this was not a normal scenario?
I actually think it's more normal than people let on.
Mm-hmm.
I get people for decades have sort of cornered me at parties and said,
Oh.
I've never shared this with anyone else.
I get that too now. I get that too all the time.
You do. I bet you do. And now it's really fun because last year or so, there have been several books of the, quote, the spiritual awakening of scientists, and more and more and more scientists are sort of sharing their experiences and naturalizing them, normalizing them. And these are courageous folks, Alex, because I was saved from being an academic scientist by the universe sort of making sure I took another route. But if I'd have been in an academic environment, I suspect it would have been very difficult. Fortunately for me, I only sort of got the sense quite late on that I was the weird one.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the word weird comes from Old English, and it means the way of wisdom. So I think we should be proud to be weird. I think we should be grateful to be weird.
Agreed. One weirdo to another, my dear.
One weirdo to another. It's the way the weird. But now more and more folks are acknowledging this. And it's very difficult. I think if you're educated, as our education systems are, with that paradigm pretty much of materialism and separation, and you went through that as I did, and then if you choose to perhaps train as a doctor or a scientist or a teacher, unless you have some own inner awakening within your own journey, you're actually in that environment and in that peer pressure and those structures and those organizations where that worldview is prevalent. Fortunately for me, and I'd love to hear your story, it still didn't occur to me to share. It wasn't that I was afraid to. I just didn't see the need to share my experiences. And then one day, and I would have been well into my late 30s, I suddenly got a sense, okay, I can start to share this. And it wasn't to try and impose it or to prove me right and anybody else wrong. It was because I was getting cornered in parties. And I did realize that there were people who really, if I was able to share, just from that place of human to human, person to person, willingness to be open and vulnerable, then it may offer other people a sort of comfort, willingness, openness, invitation to share their stories. Because it seems to me the more we do this, the more we'll recognize that this is our natural way of being. Mm-hmm. This is the weird way, but it's our natural who we really are. So that's really what happened. And I've been on that journey ever since.
As they say, the first one through the wall is the one that gets bloodied. And when you step out of line, you're the one that is going to take the arrows, as they say. But if you're able to survive that, being these brave scientists who are coming out, it does give an example to so many others that you're like, oh, if he or she did it, maybe I can start talking about it. And I think the world is in a place now, in an awakened place, that it accepts these conversations so much more than it did before. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the anomaly that is quantum physics. It annoys the Newtonians so much. It annoys the materialists so much. And what it's the connections between spirituality, between ancient texts that are science seems to be catching up to what they've been talking about for thousands of years. What is your feeling on that? How that is coming up? Our conversation is a spiritual, scientific, quantum physics conversation as we continue to go. These conversations were unheard of 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
They were. And maybe the easiest way of responding to that is to go back to before the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. Because up to that point, the worldview was Newtonian. But I have to say, giving Isaac Newton a break, he's now often recognized as being the last of the alchemists rather than just the first, or one of the first of the natural philosophers or scientists. And he and others, I would say especially Francis Bacon, who also gets a really bad rap sometimes as the father of the scientific method, I think for both of them, they were very spiritual people. And I think for both of them, they were rather trying to move beyond the superstition of their era and authority of a church that really was preventing any rational investigation of the deeper nature of reality. And them and Copernicus, Galileo, all the folks who were the pioneers of that time were incredibly brave, because it wasn't just that you might be sort of disparaged by your peers, you might get burned at the stake.
Absolutely.
This is serious stuff. This is serious stuff.
The Galileo effect. The Galileo effect is literally a term.
Absolutely. So, but the point is that the more, therefore, that exploration of the physical world continued, the view of the church authorities was, okay, you can investigate this, but you're not investigating anything beyond this. So this sort of schism gradually took place between science and spirituality. And that continued until by the 19th century, we had an incredible mechanistic worldview of materialism and separation. And that became not just the scientific worldview, as we both know, it became the societal perspective. With the Industrial Revolution, organizations, companies, corporations, governments, all of it, education, healthcare, were all based on this worldview. And so, by the 20th century, when the quantum pioneers and Einstein were discovering what were phenomena that were incredibly anomalous to that mechanistic viewpoint, that were really giving us clues to this deeper nature of reality, that was pushed to the side. And even Einstein was uncomfortable with quantum physics, as I'm sure you know, he called it spooky action at a distance, and we can come back to that. But the reality was, what they were unveiling, what were they revealing, were giving us clues that have literally lasted and hung around philosophically for the last century. But now we're discovering more and more and more such anomalous phenomena and perspectives that the old pre-quantum, pre-relativity, mechanistic worldview of separation and materiality just can't hold anymore, because the evidence is so compelling that it now, those clues from 100 years ago are now coming front and center, because what they're doing is, instead of them just being clues that mind and consciousness are primary to reality, the evidence we're seeing at all scales of existence and numerous fields of research is bringing that front and center into an unavoidable perspective. And that's what I'd love us to explore, because this is so exciting, because we now get evidence for it,
Right. It is. It's the equivalent of, the concept of the earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around it, to the point where you're like, there's just too much evidence now to state that's just not true, guys. But that's what God said. No, he never said that. You said that. No, I never saw facts. There's on email.
Absolutely. And when people say this could be the second, Copernican revolution, or even the second or third quantum and relativity, I think it's even more transformational and groundbreaking, because, when Copernicus undertook the sort of no, guys, the sun is the center. And at that time, it was the center of the world, because we didn't know that there were vast space and time beyond our visible world. For most people, it really didn't matter. They went on with their lives. When quantum physics and relativity physics came in, although for folks like you and I, who are, dare I say it, we're weird and we're nerds and we were so excited by it, for most people, it was the world of the very small or the world of the very large. It wasn't their everyday lives. This, I think, is different, because what this is showing is that mind and consciousness aren't something we have but literally what we and the whole world are. And this evidence that I'm just, beginning to sort of share isn't just at those tiny quantum scales or the very large, spatial, galactic, universal scales. It's in our everyday lives. We're finding the same patterns underlying earthquakes and underlying human conflicts. We're seeing the way that galaxies grow is the same as the way cities grow. We're seeing the way that ecosystems are informed. So is the internet. We're seeing the same patterns that affect us every day of our lives are the same patterns that are all pervasive throughout the whole universe. And they matter because it's how we choose, it's how we behave, it's how we relate. So that's why I think this is even more substantial, as it were.
Well, so you use the word consciousness, and that's a kind of loaded word because there's so many definitions for consciousness. How do you define consciousness in this conversation?
I try not to.
Move on. Next question.
Nothing to see here. For me, I define consciousness as self-aware, sentience, self-awareness. And I talk about mind and consciousness because most of the folks that have studied and parsed the understanding of consciousness and mind for their whole lives and very specialized within it, and the ancient understanding talks about cosmic mind as being the ground of all being, which my experiences wholly correlate with and relate with. So for me, we are microcosmic co-creators in a universe that is conscious, that is living, that exists and evolves as a non-locally unified entity, but it is a finite thought of the infinite and eternal mind of the cosmos, whether one wants to describe that as God or Allah or Great Spirit, Great Mystery, the ground of being, source, whatever it may be, that infinite and eternal, but mindful wholeness, and a universe which is a great effulgence, a great thought, a great breath, a great, conscious exploration, but on a finite scale of that.
But there's also so many levels to consciousness because there is our consciousness, animal consciousness, plant consciousness, the planet's consciousness, the universe, galaxy's consciousness. I mean, just our solar system and how it works. There is a consciousness around that, as well as our own planet's ecosystem. We are, in many ways, ants on the molehill of Earth. Like we are the little creatures that are doing all sorts of things, just like there are little creatures in our backyard that are doing things. Some doing good things, some doing not so good things. Some weeds are popping up here and there. But is that do you think that's fair to say?
Oh, very, very fair. And this is where the evidence is pointing. This is the thing. And as you said earlier, the evidence is pointing to where the ancient wisdom, especially for me, the Vedic tradition of ancient India, and the Vedic tradition was one that, a number of the quantum physicists literally went out to India because they were realizing that what they were seeing, that the observer and the observed are not separate, that there is potential, that there is all-pervasive intelligence, and that it's arising from deeper levels, non-physical levels of causation. Those of them who are already aware of the Vedic tradition, were sharing the word, and they were going out and saying, look, we're finding this. And the rishis, the Vedic sages, were saying, yes.
We've known this for thousands of years.
Thousands of years, but it's wonderful that now we have this convergence. But yes, and so for me, our entire universe exists and evolves as a living, sentient, conscious, non-locally unified entity that from its first moment, 13.8 billion years ago, began not in a big bang. It wasn't big, we know that. And it wasn't a bang, it was incredibly fine-tuned and ordered. But it wasn't just ordered and fine-tuned in that moment. Ever since, it's been a big breath, this incredible out breath. as space has expanded and time's flowed forward, to be able to experience ever more complexity and self-awareness and individuated self-awareness. So it is a journey of mind and consciousness. And for me, yes, we're ants. My Aboriginal friends call us Mingu.
Mm-hmm.
And especially
Which
when
means?
people used to climb, it means ants. They used to call the the tourists who climbed what we call Ayers Rock or Uluru Mingu, and now it's not allowed, but that's what they called them. But we are microcosmic co-creators.
Yeah.
Because everything in our universe, what we're being shown and seen, is that everything in existence has meaning. Even the weeds in your garden and the ants that bite you and the, whatever, everything in existence has intrinsic meaning and evolutionary purpose. And that's the incredible new understanding and story that the evidence is pointing to, but that the ancient traditions told us of, the indigenous wisdom keepers have told us of.
Yeah, and you were saying that before the scientists were going over to India to study the Vedics and starting, physicists are starting. They were doing that in the early 19th century or 18th century. Oh, excuse me, 20th century,
20th
and
century.
yeah, and even Oppenheimer.
Yes.
Oppenheimer literally quoted, I think it was Shiva.
Bhagavad Gita. I think I become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Yeah, because he was even seeing the connections between back then, but they weren't popular. They weren't put out popular. Like they weren't put out like, oh, well, hey, everybody, we figured this out. It was a very small sect of scientists and now it's becoming more and more and more and more growing. And more scientists I talk to on the show, more quantum physicists I talk to on the show, every one of them says, look, there's the public face of a quantum physicist and the private face in the parties, in the corners of the parties. And they can't publicly say things that they believe in because it would be career suicide or academic suicide at the place that they happen to be. And then there's those brave souls that decide to come out and go, you know what? I disagree. This is what the evidence is pointing to. I mean, just the concept of quantum entanglement is annoying to a materialist.
But the reality of it is, you may be aware of this, the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022 was given to 3 quantum researchers, Don Clauser, Alan Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger. And they've been studying the universal non-locality, quantum non-locality, for decades upon decades, experimentally. And the Nobel Prize for Physics is only given to settled science. If it's controversial, the prize isn't given. So, for example, Einstein was awarded his Nobel Prize, not for relativity theory, because it was still seen as controversial, but for the photoelectric effect, whereby photons of light ping out quanta from a metal. And that showed, in fact, the quantized nature of energy matter, along with folks like Max Planck and others. So the fact that the Nobel Prize for Physics last year was given to the scientists studying universal non-locality, I think is a threshold moment for science. And the other thing is, in 2018, a group at MIT and other universities, which included Anton Zeilinger, had experimentally managed to what's called entangle, in other words, literally create as a single entity, as it were, photons of light in a laboratory with starlight from 600 light years away, from photons of light from what's called a quasar, which is a very active, very ancient galactic center, 12.2 billion light years away, showing the cosmological scale of quantum non-locality. But you see, this goes back to the very beginnings of quantum physics, because it was realized that for quantum mechanics to work at all, the entire universe had to be non-locally entangled.
Correct.
Yeah? And that's something called Bell's inequality, Bell's theorem, Bell's inequality. So what that 2018 experiment was able to do was to show that the levels of entanglement exceeded Bell's inequality, and therefore showed that quantum non-locality was at cosmological scales. And although people don't talk about it so much, that the appearance of our universe, its quantized energy matter and its non-quantized space-time, do emerge from deeper non-physical realms, which is what quantum physics says they do. But everybody went, la, 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 la. Don't need to look at this. Let's look at the technology instead.
Look at my new iPhone. Isn't this pretty? Well, let me ask you the $10,000 question. What is the cosmic hologram? Are we living in a simulated reality? And is there any proof of that? From what I understand, there is, but I'd love to hear your point of view.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't describe our reality as simulated, because I think one of the speculations, and it is only a speculation going around the rounds, is that our universe is a simulation of essentially an advanced extraterrestrial culture or some
Well,
such.
that's one. Yeah, there's also the simulation. There's also the simulation theory of that God or the universe or something else is creating it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the danger of simulation is describing us as a sort of a computer game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the danger of it, to be honest, is that it takes away what we're discovering as a universe of meaning and purpose. Because, we've had the old materialist separation worldview, which has a universe that is essentially dead, that has no inherent meaning or purpose, where evolution is sort of driven by random events and essentially an accidental universe. Okay, we've now got the evidence that really is turning that on its head. But the simulation suggests something similar. It sort of disempowers us from agency. It sort of disempowers us, or could be construed to disempower us. So that's why I don't use the word. But what I would say is that, yes, the evidence is showing that essentially the reality of our universe is holographically manifested. And the proof for that, and the basis for that, goes back some while now, I mean, a number of decades, to the earliest studies of black holes and what's called the thermodynamics of black holes. And the question was, what happens when you get a massive star that at the end of its life runs out of its nuclear fuel and therefore gravitationally collapses? And because it's so massive, the gravitational collapse is so powerful that it isn't stopped. And the star, as a sphere, it was a sphere as a star, so it collapses spherically, and it collapses beyond a point called an event horizon, where the gravity is so strong that not even light can escape, hence the term black hole. Then the question was, well, what happens to all the information of that star? And to cut a long story short, it became understood that instead of the information being lost, it's retained on the event horizon, but instead also of it being proportional to the volume of the star or the black hole event horizon. In other words, the volume of that 3D sphere, it's actually proportional to the two-dimensional surface area of the event horizon. Now, to some bright folks, such as Leonard Susskind and Jacob Bekenstein and Leonard Tehuft and others, they realized that was very similar to a hologram, because in a hologram, light is shined off an object. Well, a light beam is basically split.
Right.
Part of the beam is shined off a 3D object. It could be an apple, it could be you, it could be anything we choose. And the light, when it comes back, is reflected back, is full of information about that object. When that then is combined with the other part of the beam, a two-dimensional pattern of information is produced about that 3D object. And then when another beam of light is shone through that patterning, a hologram is projected of the three-dimensional appearance of that original object, that you can walk around, that you can now acoustically, interact with all sorts of incredible technologies. But when those folks expanded what they were discovering about the information of black holes and expanded it to the whole universe, they realized that our entire universe could be a holographic projection of information projected as the appearance, the three-dimensional appearance, or the four-dimensional appearance of space-time, the three-dimensional of space and the one-dimension of time. Now, since that time, virtually every theoretical framework that's pushed forward string theory or pushed forward, try to quantize gravity or just try to make sense of stuff, has come to a very similar conclusion, that we can actually better explain the appearance of our universe as a holographic projection and one of meaningfully informed information. So I sometimes joke that quantum physics is so 20th century because we're now realizing that the appearance of our universe, it's quantized space, it's quantized energy matter, and I'll use a different word here, it's entropic space-time, is both arises from deeper levels of intelligent, meaningful, mindful, sentient causation as information expressed as quantized energy matter and information expressed in a complementary way as entropic space-time. And when you bring those together, which I've done in my last couple of books, you get a framework where, we very straightforwardly, you expand the 3 laws of thermodynamics to laws of information, and suddenly, like a Rubik's Cube, everything just pulls together. And you can understand how our universe exists and evolves in this way.
First of all, this is heresy. You shall be burned at the stake any day now.
My feet are getting very warm as we speak.
I mean, you're basically throwing so much. I mean, I love that explanation, by the way. That's such a beautiful, elegant explanation of what the hologram, the cosmic hologram that we're living in. Because and please correct me, I've heard now that they're discovering that even in the center of every galaxy, there is a black hole, which then, so in the middle of the Milky Way somewhere, yes, there's a black hole that has created this. Now, arguably and theoretically, based on what you just said, that could be the reflection of that black hole is creating the reflection of this galaxy. Is that a possibility?
It's certainly an intriguing perspective of it, because we are now speaking of a universe that exists and evolves as a living, sentient, conscious, non-locally unified entity from its very beginning, its tiny, tiny, fine-tuned beginning 13.8 billion years ago. And we're also now realizing that those what's called supermassive black holes, as you refer to the middle of our Milky Way, looks to be at the center of all, if not many, many, but possibly all galaxies as they evolve from those earlier epochs. And our supermassive black hole is not that big. I mean, it's 3 million sizes of our soul, but there's one that's just been discovered, I think, that's 30 billion suns in the scale of it. I mean, they're absolutely vast. And we're very fortunate because ours is quite quiescent. Some are very active, but ours is quite quiescent. But essentially, they are in essence, they are aspects of the memory of our world, of our universe moving forward. But don't forget, when I talk about the cosmic hologram, I'm talking about our entire universe, the boundary of what we call space-time as a two-dimensional boundary, one of space, one of time. The reason space expands and time flows is that without that, it could exist, but it could evolve, because every moment, what's called the Planck scale moment, at every Planck scale of that boundary, which is minute, further information, further, if you like, universal information can then be holographically projected. And that enables us to have this conversation 13.8 billion years after that first moment where our universe was as simple as it could be, but no simpler, rather like a baby universe, to begin this incredible evolutionary journey. But space expanding means every moment there is more of that holographic boundary. You know, the Indian tradition has the Akashic record, essentially.
Oh, yeah, of course.
That story. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this then. I'll be devil's advocate here. If we are a hologram and we're living in a holographic environment, how are we physical? Because when I see a hologram, you could push right through it. It's not a physical thing. So what consists of this materialism that we are in, this physical aspect to it?
Well, first of all, when we drill down, we've known this as long as the quantum, know, understanding, you get to 99.99999999999% no thingness. And what's remaining is relationships and informational relationships.
Okay.
You know, when I was at school, I was taught atoms were little billiard balls. They're not. They are vibrational, informational relationships. But the other sense of that, so our universe is innately relational, but it's not solid. The reason we're not grey gloop, the reason we don't sink through the floor, are aspects of quantum mechanics, which is the Pauli exclusion principle primarily, which means that for the particular types of entities that make us up, those waveforms that we call, you know, quarks and electrons, they can't occupy the same quantum state at the same time. Yeah. So all the makeup of our bodies can't occupy the same quantum state. So we don't just merge into each other. Whereas light, which is a different type of phenomenon, can do, which is why holograms can hold so much information. But the other force that's coming into this appearance of separation is electromagnetism. So we have what's called electrostatic repulsions, because the outer orbits of electrons in atoms are negatively charged, and like repel. So we have the Pauli exclusion principle and the phenomena of electromagnetism that, you know, make our appearance as solid, even though we're not.
Right. And as I asked that question, I'm saying it more for people listening. But the second you said, well, you know, I'm like, yeah, I forgot about that. We are pure energy and there is no space if you drill down deep enough. So we're basically it seems almost like we're code. There's a programming code behind all of this, in the sense, not literally, I'm saying, but as an analogy. Yeah. There is the code of our bodies, and then the DNA. And then if you want to start getting into a little bit more metaphysical aspects of things, karma and all these other aspects, generational karma, you know, why is there a mole in your back? Why can't you do this? What's causing that? There's no reason. All this kind of coding, and it's all information. It seems like it's constant information moving in and out all the time.
It really is. And I've been accused of being obsessed with hyphens, because I write in hyphen formation to really differentiate between some meaningless gobbledygook and the meaningful information, which is the basic stuff of our universe, of the whole world. And as you say, Alex, you know, what this cosmic hologram model, and that I continue to write about in the story of Gaia too, which is the evolutionary story of what that means, is a meaningfully informed universe, which is also multidimensional. So it has levels of intelligence, archetypal intelligence, in both incarnate and discarnate forms. So it's a much grander, most wondrous, exciting, you know, story and a new and unitive narrative where, you know, everything in existence has meaning and evolutionary purpose, which means we do too.
Yeah, without question. I love what you're saying in regards to the multi-dimensional, because this is one dimension. Then I've spoken to so many near-death experiencers, and they visited another dimension of some sort, out-of-body experiencers, channels, other people talking. And then if you go into the Vedic texts, they talk about like, I think it's 49 levels of different consciousness that you can grow into. Ascended masters go to, so, and you constantly are evolving. There's so much into it. But now that the scientists like yourself are starting to quantify it for us in a different way, where it's not woo-woo anymore. We're getting farther and farther away from woo-woo and getting more and closer to reality and proof and evidence. But I have to ask you a question. This is a question because you've mentioned it a few times in our conversation. Time.
Yes.
Now, my perspective on time is it is a man-made object, and our time is based around the rotations around our sun. If you leave our solar system, time does not exist in the way, and it's not going to be 12 o'clock somewhere. It's not going to be 1 o'clock somewhere. What is your definition of time in the scope of universal time versus our little 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock thing that we got going on here?
Well, before I do that, before I forget, I love to say we're moving from woo-woo to wee-wee, because this is
great. That's wonderful. I love that.
This is who we really are. Yes, I think this is a really common misunderstanding, if please, to honor that perspective. Because when Einstein realized that space was relative to the position of an observer and time was relative to the position of an observer, I think that wasn't his greatest genius. He continued to follow the evidence, and what he followed it to was that, yes, space is relative, yes, time is relative of themselves, but we have to bring them together as invariant, what's called invariant space-time. So what he understood is when we describe an event, we can't just say 3 dimensions of space. Yeah, we have to say 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. And when we bring that 4-dimensionality into a measurement, it doesn't matter whether we're making that measurement here on Earth, a galaxy far, far away and a long, long time ago, or wherever. And that invariance of space-time means that we can, as cosmologists, talk about a universe that began 13.8 billion years ago as that first tiny, tiny moment of an ongoing out breath, an ongoing big breath, as I describe it. And the way that this works is that as space expands at every, in a Planck scale area, and this is minute, this is named after Max Planck, who was one of the great pioneers, but at every Planck scale time, which is also minute, more and more and more and more information is able to be holographically manifested within space-time. So we do have universal time, otherwise we couldn't, the laws of physics wouldn't work, nothing would hang together.
Right.
But we also have this personal perspective of time. Einstein once said, and it was only he who could say this and get away with it probably, that if you sit on a hot cooker, a minute feels like an hour, but if you're sitting with a beautiful young girl, an hour feels like a minute. Now, that's a personal sense of time.
Yeah.
But I'm talking here about the both and. Yes, and our perspective of time, so much of our biology is based on our position on our planetary home going round our sun. But I'm going way beyond this and saying it's a both and, that as cosmologists, as humans, we can also understand that our entire universe is undertaking a journey of space-time, where there is a universal time and it's one-way flow, and it goes from the past to the present, and at each moment we're at the bow wave of that here and now, with the future still to unfold.
It's really interesting. If you watch that movie Interstellar, Chris Nolan's.
Don't get me started on that movie.
Is that a bad movie or a good movie? Tell me.
I love the movie. I deplore the science because it's
okay. Fair enough. Regardless of that, but the concept of what they said in regards to when they were in the spaceship, they're at let's say a 24-hour period. But if you go down to the planet, every minute that goes by is a year. Every 5 minutes goes by, it's a year. And then when they got back, 15 minutes later, the guy is 75 years old or something like that. Yeah. I'm fascinated now with this cosmic time.
Yes.
Universal time, as you called
Universal
it.
time. Yeah.
Because it is, I agree with you 100%. There has to be we are in a, if I leave this planet and travel a million light years from now,
Yes.
my body will still break down based on whatever measurement of time I'm used to. It could be 5 seconds. Look at the measurement of time in dogs and cats. Dog years versus art. It's a different perspective and a different conscious perspective of where we're at. So my year is 7 years of my cat, or let's say dog, because it's called dog years. They estimate. Yeah. So they're experiencing time completely different than we are, just like an ant or a gnat that lives for 24 hours. Completely is a different perspective than ours. So there is a form of time. I think that we get caught up in the whole revolving around the sun time, which is like 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, is the master time clock. But there is a universal kind of clock that's different, which is how you can say 4 billion years ago, or 3.8 billion.
Absolutely. And yeah, but it's not an either or, it's a both and. So as you say, your dog's experience his or her life in the way he or her is experiencing that life, and the timing of that life, as will be a mayfly, as is you and I. And the whole universe is experiencing. Now, the universal time is measured in what we call Planck seconds. But the point of the Planck scale, it really is, it shows us this deeper understanding of our universe's reality, because there are 4 constants in the universe that we could measure in whatever measures we want to, but they're the speed of light, the gravitational constant, Planck's constant, and what's called Boltzmann's constant, which is around thermodynamics. When you bring them together, they shake out into 5 measures of energy and matter and space and time and temperature. Now, those measures can actually do what scientists call normalize. In other words, a Planck distance can be identified as the distance that light, that constant light, travels in 1 Planck time. So they can all come down to the number 1, which means that whether you and I were measuring them in our measures, or some being, extraterrestrial being far into the future or far into the past was measuring them, they would tell them as they're telling us foundational understanding about the nature of reality of our universe. And that's why we can talk about universal space-time and universal energy matter in the way we can, and it all hang together as a non-locally unified entity, where time can be measured from that point 13.8 billion years ago. And with every Planck scale time, as space also expands and time flows, to tell this story of our universe. And yet we can also, and it is a both and, experience the passing of time in our own self-aware consciousness.
We've all done that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're engrossed in a book, watching a movie, having a conversation, an athletic situation where you're in the flow, as they say, that time stands still. All of that stuff.
All of that. And also, once we move beyond this cosmic hologram in these dimensions of space-time, so, our universe both knows itself in its wholeness because of its non-local universality, and within space-time, the speed of light is the cosmic speed cop, which enables that causality, that universal causality, to play out over all of these 13.8 billion years and ongoing. So again, it's this both and. But when we move into discarnate, multidimensional levels of existence and awareness, I'm sure you've had so many conversations, and I've had many, many experiences, that the sense of time is very different.
Oh, absolutely. Time has flown as you and I have been speaking. I don't even, it just, when you're engrossed in something, your consciousness, your attention is on something so intently, time stands still or flies by in a way, just like Einstein said, when you're with your loved one, a minute, or an hour feels like a minute. Yes. But if you're sitting at the DMV trying to get your license renewed. An hour, a minute seems like an hour.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
No question whatsoever. No, it is fascinating. And I've heard now, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that because you're saying the speed of light, that the expansion of the universe is going faster. Is that true or not? I heard that somewhere.
No, it's not. But what you probably heard it as was a very, very early epoch of the universe that's hypothesized. It's not yet proven.
Okay.
Called the inflationary period.
Right.
Now, the inflationary period was really a hypothesis put forward to get over the sort of the homogeneity of our universe, and the horizon, what's called the horizon problem of our universe. But when we move into this perspective of a cosmic hologram, where the whole universe is non-locally unified, that view and that framework does not need an inflationary epoch. And the inflationary epoch was perceived to be where space, the whole of space expanded faster than the speed of light. So I'm happy to follow wherever the evidence leads, but the evidence is not yet in that there was indeed an inflationary epoch, even though that's often, seen as a fact. It really isn't. We haven't got the proof of that yet. And it brings its own problems with it, because nobody knows how it would start, if it started, and nobody knows how it would stop.
If it's ever going to stop.
Well, the idea is that there's lots of buddings off of universes, and there's a wonderful rule of thumb in science called Occam's razor, which is basically go with the simplest it can be, but no simpler, which is an Einsteinian quote as well. And this really violates, in that sense, Occam's razor. And I don't think it's necessary. So we'll see. We'll see.
Well, let me ask you this, because, again, I've heard this concept that the universe is infinite. And if it's not infinite, what the hell's on the edge?
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that. There's nothing in space-time, nothing that is infinite. Every measure within space-time of our universe is finite. Mm-hmm. Our universe began a finite time ago, not an infinite time ago, a finite time ago. Mm-hmm. We also know, looking at analysis of hydrogen, that about 9 billion years ago, our universe had a huge sort of push of stellar formation, which uses hydrogen. And that has progressively fallen off. So our universe has very, very little hydrogen left to make more stars. But the biggest one of the other thing is that from the very early epoch of our universe, when it became transparent to light and atoms could form, it began to there was a radiance throughout space. As space has expanded ever since, that radiance has moved into the has been stretched into microwave wavelengths. And it's now called the cosmic microwave background. When that was analyzed, tiny little temperature differences that were analyzed only a few years ago. And first of all, they were found to embed the patterns that I was referring to earlier, these patterns that are all scales of existence and across numerous fields of research. We call them fractals. Mm-hmm. But those temperature differences were seen to be fractals, but also they were only a finite wavelengths. They fill all of space. So there's nothing in space and nothing in the cosmic microwave background that is not finite, okay? We also now know from this framing of a cosmic hologram that it is itself finite. It's a holographic boundary that is a boundary of a conscious but finite universe. And the final piece of sort of, if you like, potential evidence is that our universe began in its hottest state, its Planck scale temperature, and its lowest informational content, or what I call entropy. And ever since, as space has expanded and time's flowed, the temperatures dropped and the entropies increased. Now, we're now at a temperature of only 2.7 degrees above absolute zero, whereas it started at a temperature of 10 to the 32 degrees Kelvin, trillions and trillions of times hotter than the center of our sun. So we're right down at the sort of the final, pushes, as it were, where the entropy, the informational content's still expanding, but the temperature will fall, and it can't fall below absolute zero. So that again suggests a finite ending. Now, what's then beyond it? Infinity, eternity.
Right.
This is where we get back to the Vedic sages.
Right. And because science can go so far.
Yes.
And until we finally, until you run into a wall, meaning like, okay, so the big breath, got it. The Big Bang, if you want to call it that, fine, whatever. What was there prior? Where did it come from? How did it, and this is where you have to kind of go into the spiritual, have to kind of dig into the Vedic and into these ancient ideas that are far beyond what we can comprehend yet. And we're still trying to figure out things that they've been saying for thousands of years, and they're discovering new things in archaeology and all this. Let's not even get into ancient civilizations, because that could be a whole other lovely conversation we could have. A whole other subject. But it is fascinating that we are, I mean, by the way, that was a beautiful explanation, by the way. I've learned immense amount of stuff in this conversation. But let me ask you something, because I've heard this term thrown around. I'd love to hear what you think of it. What is sacred geometry, and how does that affect the role of how it's just the universe is structured?
Well, there is a teaching, there's a curriculum of teaching called the quadrivium, and that means fourfold. And it comes back to this ancient universal wisdom teachings perspective that everything in what we call reality is essentially number. With the cosmic hologram and the understanding that, we just touched on today, that number, those numbers, those basic numbers are ones and zeros of digitized information, with me being obsessed by the hyphen, meaningful information. And they are the pixelation of our universal reality at the Planck scale. And they then accumulate to form, literally, to form the appearance of quantized energy matter and entropic space-time. But from those zeros and ones, we can express numbers. We can express numbers, for example, in a Fibonacci series of 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. And we find the Fibonacci series and many, many other numerical relationships form the patterning at all scales of existence. But the quadrivium, founded on this cosmology of idealized numbers, talked of music as being number in time and geometry as being number in space. So when we talk about sacred geometry, it's just a recognition of the sacredness of creation, of this beautiful, spiritually based, universally consciousness basis of all that we call our reality. So there is such a, and the ancient Greek geometers, who only had a sort of straight edge and something to run with and mark with, realized that, we had 5 types of 3-dimensional appearances of perfect solids called the Platonic solids, the tetrahedron, the cube, etc. And in 2 dimensions, a tetrahedron is a triangle. Now, what we realize now is that instead of the idealized shapes, where, triangles, same relationships, you can scale it up, scale it down, same relationships. We now discover through analysis of vast amounts of data, these so-called these so-named fractal patterns, which at their what's called their asymptote, their convergence, become those idealized shapes. But because clouds are fractal, river systems are fractal, the solar wind is fractal, atoms cluster their electrons fractally when they change from insulators to metals, these are not the idealized, but they are relational. They are innately relational, and they also scale up and scale down. So these are the patterns of reality. So all is sacred geometry.
That's beautiful. Beautifully stated. Beautifully stated. And speaking of the shape of a triangle and math, I'd love to hear your point of view on the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, and the math that's embedded in it. It is so profound.
Yes, it is.
It is a message of I think it's, I forgot what the exact mathematical equation is, but if you multiply it by X number, you get the circumference of the earth. And then if you do another one, the height of it is the height of the earth. It's like, it was like almost the ancients were leaving this information behind in the only way they knew that was not going to be erased,
Yes.
and not taken out. Where do you think this detailed information came from? Because I love ancient civilization. I love ancient history. I love all this. That's another conversation we could have at another time, because I would love to get into it with you about that as well. But it seems that the pyramids, which should have gotten better with time, degraded. It went straight downhill.
Yeah.
And it was like, that was the peak. The Sphinx was the peak of whatever was there at that time, the people and so on. And the technology kept getting worse and worse and worse. What is your thoughts behind who created it, what created it, and how in God's green earth could they have inserted such precise mathematical equations in the geometry of a pyramid at a time when, quote unquote, we were supposed to be, you just, running around in the sand, to praying to Ra. Like, seriously.
Absolutely. It is another conversation because it is so vast. But many years ago, clairaudiently, I was given that we would come to a time, and I do feel it's now, when we would literally remember who we really are. And we would remember our terrestrial, our intraterrestrial, and our extraterrestrial heritage. And it seems to me that we're on the threshold of so much of this now. And it's a remembering that is inviting us to open our hearts and our minds to these incredible possibilities and understanding. Not so that we open our mind and, and our brains drop out. It really is. But the evidence is being discovered now in so many ways. And, we're at a situation where, for the first time, we have NASA investigating UFOs, UAPs. We have, we have Congress, we have so much, we have pilots, 100 now, I think more pilots have just signed a new letter saying disclosure. We're on the threshold, I think, of what I was given many years ago, that this will be a time of remembering. So those ancient mysteries, those incredible abilities, I think are now, being rediscovered and reevaluated and reopened up, and we'll have a much more profound perspective of this. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is what this is showing us, and what the evidence is showing us, is it's naturalizing multidimensional communications. So, synchronicities, supernormal phenomena, not supernatural, not paranormal, supernormal. These are our naturalized, heritage as microcosmic co-creators of this wonderful, marvelous universe. So I think we're in an incredible moment, and it's a crucial moment of choice, because our worldview of materialism and separation has brought us to this edge of an abyss. Mm-hmm. And unlike, I know a lot of folks, and it really is an incredibly challenging moment, but just sense, and I know you do, and I hope our listeners do, just sense the invitation of our universe to grow up, to become its co-evolutionary partner of consciousness, to remember that we're not just human beings. Our planetary home Gaia is sentient. We're Gaians. Mm-hmm. If we can do that, and we have the evidence now to support us, that, as my dear friend Joni Carley says, unity isn't an aspiration, it's our existential reality. My other dear friend, Julie Kroll, says, unity isn't ideal, it's real. So what do we wake up to be where the unity is expressed in radical diversity, where we have meaning and purpose, and uniquely so.
It's so beautiful the way you stated that. And it's, I think we're getting better at it, but I think there's so much of this dogmatic programming that we have been forced throughout our existence, that if it skews away from the programming that we've had since, and I use the word programming strategically because, you know, as we're born, we're programming around us of people and our parents' beliefs and all this kind of stuff. If anything differs from our foundational programming of what the world is, the reality is, God, the universe, our religion, what a position of a woman is and a man is in society, and all of these things, when that is challenged, that's when wars happen. That's when action happens. That's when you fight to defend it. I do see an opening of those ideas, especially in the newer generation. The older generation is just ground in. I believe my generation is kind of a bridge generation because we have one foot in the old and we have one foot in the new. I knew what it was like before the internet. I knew when it was born. I knew and how it is afterwards, where my children were born in a place where they just don't understand a time where you couldn't have every bit of information at your fingertips whenever you wanted. So it is interesting to see how we're going to move forward as a species.
I agree. And you know, for me, it's really interesting. This year, 2023, is the 400th anniversary of a book called De Augmentum Scientiarum by Francis Bacon. And I mentioned earlier, you know, he's often given a bad rap as sort of leading us into this materialist, you know, perspective. Reading his work and knowing some of the scholars that have studied his work for a very long time, I would suggest a different perspective, that he realized, as I mentioned, that his world was steeped in superstition and it was no longer and it was not healthy. And so the scientific method was a method of being able to follow where the evidence led. And for him, my perspective is that he hoped it would reveal the divine. It wouldn't get rid of the divine. It would reveal it and bring it into a greater understanding of the nature of reality. And there's a very esoteric pulse around 400 years. And this year is the 400th year anniversary. So I'm just sort of sitting and waiting and drinking my tea and, and doing all I can to say, this is the year. But just to perhaps finish with your point, because I'm part of a group of thought folks around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And their realization that with the siloed thinking of the worldview that, you know, you've been describing, that those sustainable development goals cannot be implemented because they're not they don't recognize the full interconnectedness of all that they're seeking to try and achieve. And so last year I worked with a group of folks and came up with what we call a unitive narrative, which is a new narrative of unity and diversity based on the evidence. But just before the end of last year, the United Nations, for the first time in its 77-year history, formally adopted a grouping of NGOs and other organizations, what's called a thematic cluster based on unity, a unitive thematic cluster, whose aim is to bring all of this understanding into implementations and interventions and capacity building and education and governance and all the other. And so a lot of my work and many, many others now are really, you know, hoping to share and invite. And it's not an imposition, Alex, and it's not a threat, because all ways are all paths up the same mountain in this understanding. So it's an invitation to join the party and honor every path and all paths.
Dr. Jude, I can talk to you for another 3 or 4 hours without question. I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. What is your definition of living a fulfilled life?
For me, it's a life of experiencing that I belong to the whole world, that there is no separation for me. So It's a life of love. It's a life of joy. It's a life of gratitude. It's a life of curiosity. It's a life of meaning, whatever that meaning is for me. It's a life of purpose, whatever that purpose is for me. And it's also a life where I feel at my happiest, my most joyful, when I serve the good of the whole.
How do you define God?
God is everything.
Simple as that. If you had an opportunity to go back to your younger self and give your younger self, that little girl, a piece of advice, what would it be?
Get over yourself.
Very true, especially if it's a teenage version of you. And last question, what is the ultimate purpose of life?
To love and to know that we're to love and to know that we're loved, that we are microcosmic co-creators, meaningful, purposeful in a loving universe.
And where can people find out more about you and pick up your book, The Story of Gaia, and all the other work you're doing?
The website is www.WholeWorld-View.org, which is an organism. It's not an organization. It's an organism that I co-founded in 2017 when the Cosmic Hologram was launched. And our aim is to serve the understanding, experiencing, and embodying of unitive awareness. So that has loads of resources.
Fantastic. And do you have any parting words for our audience?
Somebody once asked me, what would be my guidance to myself? And my guidance to myself, if I ever have a quandary in life, is to choose love, just to choose love.
As Wayne Dyer said so beautifully, when you have the chance to be right or the chance to be to either to love or to be right, always choose love. Or be kind. To be kind or to be right, choose being kind.
Always be kind, always choose love.
My dear, it has been a pleasure and honor speaking to you. I have to have you back. It is a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much for not only this conversation, but for what you do in the world to try to awaken us all to the truth of where we're at, my dear. Thank you so much.
Bless you, Alex. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much. And I'm back at you.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.